Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be talking about why longer swords are typically better in duels. Now of course it's worth bearing in mind that we are talking about a particular scenario, so these would be people usually without armour, and of course usually one person against one person. Now what I'm talking about can apply in some cases to things like self-defense against multiple people, or into warfare, but it gets a lot more complicated than that, so we'll stick to this quite particular definition for now. So, when you're looking at some sort of duel, I mean, of course, like I said, you're typically talking about people who are not using armour, which can very drastically change how it goes, and we're typically talking about just a person versus a person in a relatively open space, but could be a more closed space. However, I think even in some confined circumstances, you could use a longer weapon very effectively, particularly thrust-oriented blades. So there are different reasons, I'll admit, why some swords are longer and some swords are shorter. And that can be depending on the metallurgy. So earlier on, certain swords just couldn't be made longer without the risk of becoming brittle or too bulky and heavy to be useful. And additionally, you've got swords which weren't really designed for that kind of thing that we're talking about now. So you look at something like a gladius, I mean, apart from looking at something like gladiatorial combat, where you're kind of deliberately putting someone at a disadvantage to use with certain equipment against certain people, really you're talking about swords that were designed for other purposes, like, for example, the gladius was there for people who wore armour, they had shields, they had a lot of people around them, and they were expected to be in very close contact with their opponents because of all of those factors. So it becomes a bit unfair to compare them and say that they were necessarily inferior, like in all cases when you compare something like a Japanese versus European sword. You can't really say one's superior and one's inferior. They were different tools for different purposes. But like I said, we're going to be talking about which tools are best for this particular purpose of a duel. So when you look at something like a long sword, when I'm fighting with one of these, there are a few factors in mind. So you look at what's called, what I've heard called the doughnut of death, which is this sort of range where maybe because you've got a shorter weapon or because one person is taller than the other, there's a range where the person at a disadvantage can't hit the opponent, but the opponent can hit them. And it's this particular range. So if people are fighting each other in any scenario, there's a sort of what in martial arts we call out of measure. So it's like if I want to hit you where the camera is now, I'm out of measure. I can obviously charge in and do something, but in terms of a normal strike, if I was trying to cut or thrust, even with something like a step at the same time, I'm out of reach and I can't hit you. So that would be out of measure. And then there's a distance, of course, where we're in measure. So if I went close enough here, I could reach and hit the camera. So it's as simple as that. However, like I said, with that doughnut of death effect, some opponents, particularly ones who are taller than me, or people who've got longer weapons, can reach me, but I can't reach them, or vice versa. And this creates a significant problem that is very often overlooked. If you look at duels in movies, for example, you could see a person who's holding their own and it's all kind of ding, 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 and they could have two knives, or they could have like a knife and a shield, or a really short sword against someone with a two-handed weapon, and it all kind of plays out like they're equal, and it's just more dependent on skill. But in real life, or in some sort of tournament or whatnot, truth be told, if you're in that range where you can be hit, but you can't hit them, it creates a world of problems, because the only things you can do are either get out of range, cover, and just keep blocking until the opponent does something stupid, or just charge in, with the last two kind of combining, depending on what your strategy is. But either way, if you can't hit the opponent, then they can do pretty much whatever they want. Now this doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to create an easy opportunity, because humans are not usually that stupid, unless they're the person who's on the same road as me when I'm driving the car. But that aside, most humans aren't that stupid. So if you saw someone, like for example, when I was at Swords and Cider, one of my first ever, I went up against a person who, you know, we had a random weapons tourney, so we picked tickets out of a hat, same sort of thing like I said, unarmoured versus unarmoured, one-on-one, and we were dueling each other. And of course we had training weapons and weren't fighting for real, but I had a two-handed sword, so I got a lucky ticket, and they had a dagger. Now, bearing in mind this person was a lot more experienced than me, and this person was experienced specifically with daggers, and I was very specifically quite inexperienced with longswords, and had a rough idea of what to do with it, but I barely knew any strategies. I didn't know anything about, you know, I wasn't taught any specific techniques or tactics to use against a dagger. I just kind of went with, you know, do roughly the right sort of movements and not flail clumsily, and look at this guy with a dangerous thing, I don't want to get hit by it. So almost entirely untrained me, not particularly strong, not particularly fast, against someone who's stronger, faster, taller, better trained in general combat with both weapons involved, better trained with the specific weapon he was equipped with, against me with the opposite. So in that scenario, he should have won, right? You know, he should have easily just gone, ah ha ha, ding, and stabbed me in the face or something like that. But actually, it's not how it panned out at all. Apart from he got a hit on me at one point, because there was sort of that reset thing going on, but, you know, just like in a lot of tournaments, which admittedly isn't the most realistic, but there we are. But it meant that in all that time, he got something like a hit on me, and I hit him several times in a row. So this is a situation where we've got the extremes. So I had the long sword in two hands, he had the dagger, which isn't even a sword, of course. And it really highlighted the fact that having that longer weapon gave me such an advantage. Not being stupid, I knew that he had a dagger, and if I kind of went like this, and, you know, tried to charge up some kind of really powerful swing, he'd have plenty of time to charge in, and like a lot of you would be imagining, ah yes, I'd just let this person overswing and I'd just charge in with my short weapon. But no, I didn't do that, I didn't let him, and I'm not saying I'm unique in that. A lot of people would realise that and make sure that doesn't happen. So instead, I stuck around in the boar's tooth, which is just one of the stances, just quite low, and it was just kind of jab, 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 you know, high, low, a few carts, just kind of timidly doing what I can. And he was trying to dodge me, stay out of range, look for an opening, like, you know, it was like my sword was a skipping rope and he was looking for that time to jump. But that opportunity rarely if ever came, and if he came in just a little bit too close, bam! I wouldn't make amazingly hard hits, I wouldn't injure him too grievously if it was a real sharp sword, but it'd be enough. If it was a real fight, you know, just doing something like that. Of course, it's not quite the same as, I need to make sure I don't destroy the furniture, but not quite as much as going wham! Of course, you know, it's not going to cause that grievous, deep wound or a severance, but that's enough. Doing something like bam, you know, a cut that's causing a bleeding wound on, say, the shoulder or the forearm that's still bleeding out, especially when the blood is rushing faster in that excitement. That's enough. And of course, if he got a bit too close and was trying to charge on me, he could pretty much just run himself on my point. So with that, it meant that not having much training at all, having the longer weapon gave me a massive advantage. So going from that extreme example, even if you're looking at less extreme examples, like let's say an arming sword, this would still give me a disadvantage against something like a two-handed sword. Because of the fact that it's shorter, again, there's that range where I can't hit my opponent, and there's a range where my opponent can hit me. And yet, even if we got into that distance, where we can both hit each other, so let's say I was up against someone with a two-handed sword, did some parrying, and then closed in And then we were at the range where we can both hit each other, or let's say I just ran past a very heavy swing that he tried, missed, I closed in that distance. Apart from the actual tactics involved of, you know, an opponent swinging and requiring time to recover if they're being an idiot, or, you know, I've parried or posted so I'm controlling the weapon, the actual distance doesn't really end up helping me much, because someone with a two-handed sword can do things like half swording, so they grab their blade part of the way up and they're able to do things like joint manipulations in the elbows and bits like that. They can still parry, they could still cut even if they're doing it much tighter to the body rather than using their maximum reach. They'd be able to do things like angling thrusts, use the cross guards for close play. They can use their body to grapple me and throw me around or disarm me, pommel strikes, and all of those options are still open to them. So it's not like if I close in quite, you know, into my shorter sword range against someone with a bigger sword, that doesn't stop them from being able to do all sorts of things to me. So then we've gone from basically I have no advantage, I can't hit the opponent, they can hit me, through to we can both hit each other. Well, that doesn't sound much better to me. I don't know about you. So having that sort of thing, yes, with a shorter sword, it means I can angle for things like, for example, I can poise myself for a thrust and not have to be worrying too much about tight spaces. A shorter sword is typically going to be lighter, so I could do things like place on the opponent into a draw cut or an actual chop or parry posts and all those things faster. But again, it's only a slight difference. It's something where I'd be able to do various actions, but with a two-handed sword I wouldn't be much worse. So it's worth bearing in mind that even at a range where the shorter weapon should have the advantage, again we're looking at the fact that the two-handed or the larger weapon still doesn't have that much of a disadvantage. So again, the actual difference even after closing distance still looks quite in favour of the person with the longer weapon if they've had a chance to try and attack and create openings in the meantime. So the best way is to, I mean, if you do want to attack someone who has a longer weapon, the sorts of strategies I'd recommend would be, like I said, trying to do a cover and riposte, or doing things like finding an opening after they've done a heavy swing or something stupid, and then closing, you know, just charging in and closing a distance. But at that point, you're utilising the same strategies I'd recommend if you had equal weapons. So that's less to do with, haha, my shorter weapon gives me an advantage, and more to do with, haha, they've done this, so I can counter it in this way. But you could do that if you both had longer weapons, you know? So always bear in mind that if you see some sort of TV duel where people are there with maybe two knives or they've got short swords and they're all going ding, 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 and it's all so easy, and they're up against someone with a big two-handed sword going, ugh, you know how TV duels go. People with big swords for some reason are always exceptionally clumsy. I don't know why, it's quite annoying. But, you know, bear in mind that in an actual duel, bigger sword is better. Sorry kids, if you love your, you know, little teeny gladiator and doing all this, wouldn't work. To get someone with a long sword, no, dead. So that's that. Tell me your thoughts in the comments, and see you next time.